Great Responsibility, Chapter 9, Family Bonding. Piper barely made it to school that day. It wasn't that surprising that they hadn't closed the school down for the week. Supervillains were a regular occurrence nowadays. New York had gotten really good at recovering from their attacks. The school looked like nothing bad had happened, except the cafeteria was cleaner than usual. The school day was boring, and Mary Jane had rehearsal for her play after school, so Piper decided to web swing over to the hospital. She changed in an alley next to the entrance and hurried inside. She was escorted up to Harry's room by one of Norman Osborn's hired security guards. He'd been around a while. He stopped at the door and opened it for her. "Thanks, Frank." Harry looked up from the tablet in his hands. Piper smiled as he grinned at her. "Hey, hero, I brought you something from school." Harry grinned wider. "Cheerleaders?" Piper laughed and plopped a couple of books down on the table next to Harry. "Sorry, homework." Harry frowned slightly, looking at the books as Norman Osborn walked in. He smiled at them and placed a hand on Piper's shoulder. "Piper has your best interests at heart. She's a true friend. How about a ride home, Piper?" Piper smiled at Norman and nodded. "That would be great. Thank you, Mr. Osborn." Harry waved at Piper as she left behind his dad. Piper grinned as she waved back. Avenger's Tower wasn't far from the hospital. Piper needed a nap before she trained with her Uncle Steve for the day. Unfortunately, the universe was against her having a nap as Captain America met her at the doors to the Avengers Tower as she waved goodbye to Norman Osborn. He was dressed in his civilian clothes, a Captain America t-shirt Piper had given him for his birthday, which she had been amused to discover was on the 4th of July. Steve ruffled Piper's short brown hair as they made their way to the elevator. Once they were safely inside it, Steve turned to Piper. "Are you sure you're okay? I saw the blood on your sleeve yesterday. But when I went to talk to you last night, you were gone, and there was an uneaten piece of cake on your desk." Piper nodded. "Well, I took care of the cake when I got home. From S.H.I.E.L.D." She whispered the last two words, but Steve heard her. He frowned slightly. "Why were you at S.H.I.E.L.D.? Piper sighed as the elevator let them off on her floor. "Well, Nick Fury kind of offered to S.H.I.E.L.D. train me to help with this whole hero thing. Not that you, Auntie Tasha, and Uncle Clint haven't been amazing since you guys found out, but it was my fault those psychos ended up at my school. My fault that one of my best friends is in the hospital." Steve put a hand on her shoulder. "Everyone makes mistakes. We learn from them. Learn to be a better hero." Piper nodded and grinned. "You sound just like Fury." That was part of his sales pitch. He even brought up Dad when he was starting out. It's pretty hilarious, actually. Remind me to show you the video at some point. Steve smiled slightly. Piper made her way down the hall. "I'll meet you in the gym. I gotta throw my suit in the wash and change into my workout clothes." Steve nodded and Piper disappeared down the hall. Natasha stepped out of the shadows. Steve was still getting used to the assassin doing this and only jumped a little when she spoke. "She's a good kid. I hope she sticks with it. I don't think she's gonna like what Fury's planned." Steve raised an eyebrow at the redhead. "What do you mean?" Natasha smiled. "You'll see. You'll see." Steve rolled his eyes at the woman as she walked off down towards the elevator. He made his way to the gym that he, Clint, Natasha, Bruce, and Thor had built into one of the many spare rooms on Piper's floor. There was a lot of equipment only she and Thor could get to. There was an obstacle course that ran up one of the walls and across the ceiling. Piper arrived a few minutes later, and they started sparring. A few hours later, they were both sweating, as he had her take a few whacks at one of the reinforced punching bags he used. She put a hole in it after 30 hits. She grinned at him and shot a line of webbing across the room, grabbing their water bottles. She pulled his out of the webbing with ease and tossed it to him. He glanced over at her wrist and didn't see her web shooter. He raised an eyebrow as she drank deeply from her Iron Man water bottle. She had a lot of Avengers-themed things. Tony had gone a bit overboard when it came to merchandise, but it was all insanely popular, and it paid for the upkeep of the team, so it worked out rather well. "Invisible web shooter." Piper grinned and tapped her wrist. A device appeared. It was red and black like her costume. "S.H.I.E.L.D. does come with some perks. I've been figuring out what it does. I found camouflage mode when I took it off my costume so I could wash the costume." She was interrupted by a panel on the wall beeping, and Piper walked over to it. It was a phone call. She answered it and almost spit water as Nick Fury popped up on the screen. Please tell me you encrypted this call. She choked out, coughing on the water. Of course. I need you up at the helicarrier. With that, he simply hung up. Piper rolled her eyes and turned to Steve, who was smiling knowingly. Well, looks like duty calls. Steve patted her on the shoulder. Yeah, good luck, Spidey. Piper turned and left to go change and get to the helicarrier. Chapter 10. Monitoring. Piper arrived on the helicarrier deck about 20 minutes later and was met on the deck by Nick Fury himself. They made their way down the hall, and Piper nodded awkwardly at a few of the other people they passed. She grinned under her mask when she saw a familiar face. Clint Barton, a.k.a. Hawkeye, grinned lightly when he spotted his kind of niece walking down the hall with Director Fury. Natasha had told him that their sort of niece was joining S.H.I.E.L.D. He paused in the hall and grinned at her. Hey, Spidey, how's my favorite baby bug? He couldn't tell if she was grinning or not under her mask, but Fury rolled his eyes as several S.H.I.E.L.D. agents walked past, staring at the two. I'm pretty good, Hawkeye? Clint laughed and clapped Piper on the shoulder. Yeah, you can still call me Uncle Clint if you want to, kiddo. Have fun. He walked away and Fury sighed. This particular recruitment was going to make life much more interesting. He turned to a door on the wall, placing his eye up to the scanner. He stepped back as the door opened. Get in here and don't touch anything. Piper raised an eyebrow under her mask and stepped into the room, curious as to what Fury wouldn't want her touching. She paused as she spotted the contents of the room. It was better than the R&D department at Stark Tower. Gadgets filled almost every available space, as men in giant mech suits pulled straight out of a sci-fi movie walked around taking notes. She could hardly contain her excitement. There were quite a few inventions here that grabbed her attention, but one that caught her interest most was a very Iron Man-looking exosuit that sprouted long mechanical arms and began to climb up the wall next to it. Spider-Girl turned to look at the schematics that were laid out on the table, but before she could, Fury put a hand on her shoulder and led her to the other side of the room. Yo, Doc, meet the new kid. Spider-Girl, meet our resident tech genius, Dr. Kirk Connors. Spidey grinned under her mask and held out her right hand to shake the doctor's left. Always nice to meet a fellow genius. Belatedly, she noticed he didn't have a left hand. She was about to pull back sheepishly when he grinned and pulled his hand out of the sleeve to shake hers vigorously. A pleasure. I've been following your career closely. Very impressive. Spidey grinned. You and I are going to get along great, Doc, I can tell. Doc Connors kept talking as they walked around the room, checking out all the cool tech. He handed her a second web shooter, and she smiled, attaching it to her other wrist. Even before Director Fury approached you about joining S.H.I.E.L.D., I had my team develop an array of Spider-Girl-inspired weaponry. Spider-Girl raised an eyebrow at Fury. And if I'd said no? Fury smiled slightly. Not really an option, kid. Spidey rolled her eyes and went back to examining the second web shooter. There were a few new buttons on it. Dr. Connors grinned and showed her how to turn on camouflage mode. She was too polite to tell him she had already figured it out. Spidey grinned. Oh yeah, I had it in camo mode, but then I couldn't find it. There was a pause of silence. Spidey sighed. It's called a joke. Don't you people ever smile? Doc Connors smiled slightly and walked over to a covered piece of machinery. Over here, we have something I think you'll be particularly interested in. Spidey grinned again and stepped forward. I reserve the right to be awestruck. Her Spidey sense went off and she yanked her hand back just in time to avoid getting struck by a baton. She looked up into the face of one of her least favorite S.H.I.E.L.D. agents. Phil Coulson had been pretty cool up until he'd faked his own death right before the Battle of New York. She and the Avengers had discovered he was still alive when he had shown up in the kitchen of Avengers Tower to talk to Natasha and Clint. She glared at him from under her mask. Director Fury, I've never questioned you when it came to the others. Spidey raised an eyebrow. What others could Coulson be talking about? She didn't sign up to be part of a team. Coulson continued before she could ask. But we're dealing with a complete wild card. Daily Bugle Communications calls Spider-Girl a threat to public safety. That just made her glare intensify. But I'm so sweet and huggable. Plus, I've got so many people teaching me how to be an amazing person, it's not even funny. Coulson glared at her. Fury turned to Coulson. Spider-Girl is my responsibility. That's what she's here to learn. Responsibility. Coulson looked her up and down again and folded his baton back into a small pen-sized tube. We'll see. With that, he walked away. Piper glared after him before turning back to the covered machine. Dr. Connors motioned for her to continue, and she pulled the cover off the machine, revealing a motorcycle with a large red spider emblem that stretched from the front of the bike to the back wheel. Piper raised a slightly confused eyebrow. We call it the spider cycle. He looked quite proud of himself, and Piper didn't really want to hurt his feelings, but she had a very important question. Not to sound ungrateful or anything, but, what do I need with a motorcycle? I can get anywhere with, thwip. Piper made a mock web shooting motion. Dr. Connors smiled slightly. I calculate you can make it from 18th Street to 34th in 3.7 minutes. While using what I'm guessing is fairly expensive webbing and at maximum muscle strength. Piper rubbed the back of her neck, a bit self-conscious at being treated like a science curiosity. Not that she didn't hear that all the time from her oblivious adoptive father. Well, yeah, that sounds about right. Dr. Connors nodded, clearly pleased he'd gotten his math right. Fury grinned slightly. The spider cycle can make it in 1.5 minutes. That is if you're not scared thwipless to climb on. Piper had lived in a house full of men long enough to know a challenge when she heard one. She motioned Fury aside and swung a leg over the bike. She looked down at the hollow screen that popped up the second she placed both hands on the handles. And the starter is... She pushed the red and blue swirling emblem in the center of the dark red screen, and the bike took off without warning. Spider-Girl clinging to it as it barreled out of the lab and down the hall. She barely managed to avoid the people in the halls, including Hawkeye, whose eyes widened as he saw who was clinging to the out-of-control motorcycle. It's okay, I just have to find the brakes. She pulled on the trigger she felt under her fingers on the left handle of the bike as she careened towards a dead-end corridor. But instead of stopping, the bike shot a bolt of light from somewhere near her knee, and the wall in front of her disintegrated. She screamed as she went hurtling out of the opening. She tried to take a deep breath as the air rushed around her. That's okay, I'll just pop another web parachute, and she tried to do just that, and shot only a line of webbing that missed the helicarrier by practically a mile. Okay, now I'm scared thwipless. Chapter 11. Meeting the Others. Piper screamed, holding onto the bike for dear life. She was too high up to swing onto any buildings and just watch the bike fall. Besides, that might put some pedestrians in danger, and her gathered momentum was likely to rip her arms off. So, no good prospects. The screen in front of her lit back up and displayed Nick Fury's face. Kid. Piper smiled under her mask, but only a little. Hey, Nick, bit busy falling to my death right now. Can I call you later? He rolled his eye at her. That button with the web icon, punch it and hang on. Spidey sighed. Well, not much else to do right now. Might as well. She slammed a finger into the web icon on the screen and the bike shot out 2 lines of web. Well, now she was uncontrollably careening forward instead of falling. This was slightly better. Before she could ask, Nick Fury began explaining the gizmo that had saved her from being a very messy accident on the sidewalk below. That's the web track feature. Internal GPS targets the best places to shoot it. As awesome and amazing as that is, I am rapidly running out of room here. Nick Fury smiled. Hit the thrust button. Piper raised an eyebrow, but there wasn't much she could do but obey. She slammed her finger into the button that looked like a cheesy flame painted on the side of a sports car and held on tighter as the bike rocketed off the web line and onto a building where it continued forward with no problems at all. Piper was incredulous. You know this is impossible, right? The screen in front of her flickered and Fury's face was replaced by the face of Dr. Connors. I've engineered the bike to ride smoothly at any angle. Try it again. Piper smiled and jumped the bike from the building she was on over to the nearby Bugletron billboard. She dragged the back wheel of the bike across the screen, leaving a burn in the shape of a curly villain mustache, just before jumping the bike back over to another building. She knew it was immature, but it felt pretty good, though she'd be getting an earful from Uncle Steve later. But she didn't have a whole lot of time to linger on that, as the bike continued to run as if it had a mind of its own, racing down the side of the building and out into traffic. "What's the matter with you, kid? You act like you've never driven before." Piper laughed sheepishly as she steered the bike around cars and up the underside of an overpass. "I don't even have a permit! Think about it for a minute. I get driven almost everywhere. Besides, it's New York. Who needs a car?" She just managed to leap over a school bus full of kids before she saw the construction site. "Oh, come on." The screen on the bike flashed and Piper glanced around, ensuring that there wasn't anyone in the vicinity to be hurt if the bike hit the large truck that she was rapidly approaching. There was no one, so she flipped off the bike into the air, intending to land safely on the ground. However, something swooped out of thin air and caught her bridle style. Hey! Whoever this boy was, he was wearing a blue suit with gold accents and what appeared to be a golden bucket on his head. "Put me down, Buckethead!" Spidey would have bet money the boy under the bucket was rolling his eyes, even if she couldn't hear it. "Chill out, preschool. We'll take it from here." Spidey looked down as she realized what he'd said, "we." There were indeed other teens on the scene now. A girl in a white catsuit leaped from the top of the truck onto the motorcycle and steered it away from the collision as a boy in yellow lifted the truck out of her way. A boy in a green skin-tight suit with a black dragon on the chest and a gold mask hiding his face stepped forward and placed his foot on the front tire of the bike and smiled up at them as the boy in the bucket set Spidey back on her feet. He landed next to the others. "Look, I appreciate the hand, but I honestly didn't need it. I had this under control. Who are you guys, anyway?" Spidey said, brushing herself off. The boy in green placed his fist against the open palm of his other hand, then bowed slightly. "Iron Fist. Namaste. Kung Fu Master with fist of, well, iron." Before Spidey could talk, the other girl stepped up to her, guiding the bike. "White Tiger. Acrobatic ninja with steel claws and cat powers." Spidey nodded slightly and opened her mouth to speak, but the girl, White Tiger, just kept talking. "The big guy here is Luke K." He interrupted her. "Power Man. If she calls herself Spider-Girl, I'm calling myself Power Man. It's cool and doesn't scream I have low self-esteem." Spidey couldn't help but feel she'd just been insulted, but she let him continue. "As the others had, super strength and bulletproof skin." White Tiger sounded sarcastic as she spoke again. "Okay, Power Man." Spidey nodded at the girl. "And I've already met Captain Buckethead." Though she couldn't see his eyes, she could tell by his voice that they were narrowed under his bucket. "Name's Nova, the human rocket." There was an awkward silence. "Well, okay. Nice to meet you guys and all, but I gotta get this bike back to S.H.I.E.L.D. Power Man grinned slightly. "Small world." Glancing over at Nova, Spidey saw that he was wearing a grin that could only be described as shit-eating. Oh, no. Chapter 12. Better That Way. No, hit! No, I did not sign up to be part of a team. Agent Coulson sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "It's not a team, it's a program." Spidey didn't let him finish. "Don't even try and feed me that bullshit. I know how well your team-ups go, and don't even try to tell me I'm wrong. You of all people should know what happens when S.H.I.E.L.D. gets heroes together." With that, she turned on her heel and stalked off towards the elevator. As she left the room, she heard White Tiger shouting happily. "Yes! No toilets for the tiger." Spidey shook her head. She really didn't want to know. She stormed up to the elevator and slammed her hand into the button. After a moment, the doors opened, and Piper almost balked at the sight of Nick Fury standing in the elevator. I'll take the next one." A moment passed and the doors didn't close. Piper peeked into the elevator and saw that Fury was holding the button so the doors wouldn't close. Sighing, she stepped into the elevator and pushed the button for the hangar. There was an awkward silence. "So, you're leaving?" Piper nodded. "Yeah, and you should know perfectly well why. Things like this, teams like this, they always come at a price. They never start off well, and someone always ends up getting hurt. And someone else has to live with it." Fury nodded slowly. "True. You'd know that more than most. After the battle in New York, you almost lost everything again. I can understand that feeling." Piper sighed. "Look, I don't know your story. I doubt anyone actually does. So maybe you can. If so, you should know exactly why I'm saying no. They all seem cool, even the Buckethead, but I won't be responsible for their lives. If they want to risk their lives, that's their call, but I can't be responsible for them." The doors opened and Piper stepped out, but before she could walk away, Fury grabbed her elbow. "Kid, take some time to think about this, all right? These kids are completely new to this. They need someone who's been at this for a while, who's got the training and experience and mentors you have. Just think about it, kid. You lot could be the next team of greats, the next Avengers." Piper paused for a moment before she tapped the web shooter on her wrist, causing it to reappear. She pulled it off her wrist and handed it back to Fury, who shook his head at it. He let go of her elbow. "Good luck, kid. Let me know if you change your mind." Piper nodded and walked off down the hallway and out to the hangar. One of the technicians opened the bay doors for her as they flew past one of the taller skyscrapers, and Piper swung off. She was a few buildings away when she finally stopped and sat down on a ledge of an office building to watch the helicarrier fly away. She sighed to herself. "Come on, Spidey, buck up. You're only responsible for you. It's better that way." She tried to convince herself of that as the helicarrier flew farther into the distance. She had seen what being a team was about, saw it every day living with the Avengers. So she saw how it affected everyone. There were good things, but the all-consuming guilt when one of them was hurt, when one of them nearly died, it destroyed people. She watched it every day, and she refused to pull other people into that kind of life. S.H.I.E.L.D. could do what they liked, but she didn't want any part in it. She sighed again, looking down at the city below. Then her Spidey sense went crazy. Whoa. Spidey sense warning me of danger to the left, right, and behind? Before she could do more than twist around to look behind her, a blast of sound sent her hurtling to the roof opposite her. Before she could get up, a foot came down on her torso. Hard. "Stay down, bug." Spidey looked up into the face of Thundra as Claw leapt from the building across from them, and Wizard floated above them. Wizard grinned. "Round 2, Spider-Girl. You lose." Spidey scoffed. "So it wasn't enough that I kicked your butt in front of some school kids. Now the whole city gets to watch." Wizard threw a disc at Spidey. It attached itself to the symbol on her chest. Thundra removed her foot, and Spidey floated off the roof. Her arms pinwheeled as she tried to balance in what amounted to an anti-gravity bubble. Before she could fully orient herself, Thundra wrapped her chain around Spider-Girl's ankle and yanked her across the roof, slamming her into every surface the warrior woman could reach. She was horribly dizzy and in pain when she finally floated to a stop. "Why does everyone want to play Whack-A-Spider?" Wizard sighed. "Ever the Joker, aren't you, Spider-Girl?" Piper grinned under the mask. "Well, someone's got to have a sense of humor. You certainly don't." Wizard glared at her before motioning to Claw. The sound villain sent a wave of sound at the hero as Wizard shot a bolt of purple lightning at her. She convulsed and screamed before finally going limp. Thundra smiled. "She's out." Wizard floated up to her, tilting her chin up with one hand. "Good. Makes it all the easier to bring her to our employer."